Welcome back to 1834. We're celebrating Women's History Month, so today's guest is that caveman chick from the 60s, looking lovely. I've also got a picture of her here, working very hard to create the first ever sandwich for her husband. How nice. Anyway, let's begin. We have e4, e5, and Le Bourdonnais goes for f4, the King's Gambit, and all gentlemen must accept a gambit. McDonnell is Irish, but he accepts anyway. Knight to f3, g5, bishop to c4, and unlike Le Bourdonnais in recent games with the same opening, McDonnell doesn't push g4 here. Instead he plays bishop to g7, and now we have d4 in the centre, d6 letting the light square bishop out, and this position was last seen in match 3 game 8, although that time McDonnell had the white pieces and McDonnell played c3, and McDonnell actually won after 59 moves. This time Le Bourdonnais plays h4, and now we have h6 from McDonnell. And now Le Bourdonnais plays c3. We have knight to c6 and the pawns capture on the g file. You'll notice that Le Bourdonnais' white rook is undefended against the black rook now, but Le Bourdonnais just deals with it by capturing the black rook. The black bishop captures it back, and now we have qe2, the Queen Elizabeth move. Queen to e7, knight to a3, bishop to g4, pinning the knight against the queen, bishop to d2, so both players rapidly developing, and both players castle queenside. They're a bit wary of the open files on the king side here. Knight to f6 from McDonnell, attacking the e4 pawn, so Le Bourdonnais brings his bishop back to defend it. McDonnell adds another attacker with his rook, and Le Bourdonnais adds another defender with his rook. Now McDonnell goes for knight to h5. He's heading towards the nice outpost on g3 where no pawns can attack it. Le Bourdonnais decides to break the pin on the knight by moving his queen to f2, and McDonnell simply captures the knight. Here, Le Bourdonnais captures back with his pawn. Now, it seems as if McDonnell has a chance to turn Le Bourdonnais' flank here with the weight of his kingside pawns. So maybe capturing with the queen when the bishop captured the knight would have kept a steadier balance, but he didn't. He captured with the pawn. Now we have a6 from McDonnell and bishop to c2 from Le Bourdonnais and knight to g3, eventually coming into the nice outpost as we said. And here the Frenchman goes on the attack with bishop to a4. Now maybe pushing back with b5 would be an interesting idea for McDonnell, but instead he decides to bide his time and plays a waiting move, bishop to g7. However, this allows Le Bourdonnais to play d5 and attack the knight, and you'll see that the bishop is actually pinning the knight against the rook, so McDonnell is going to have to choose whether he wants to give up his knight or his rook here. And you can't just push b5 now, because after the pawn captures the knight, the pawn captures the bishop. The queen's coming into a7 and McDonnell is in all sorts of trouble. So what does he do? Well, let's get back to the position. He decides that he's going to keep his knight and his pawn structure intact by retreating to b8 and giving up the rook. So Le Bourdonnais captures it, the queen captures back, and now we have queen to g2 from Le Bourdonnais and queen across to h8. If you look carefully at this part of the board, Le Bourdonnais realises he prefers a bishop here instead of a rook so that he can attack the knight, so he moves the rook aside to make space, and McDonnell piles in with his flank pawns. Le Bourdonnais plays bishop to e1 to attack the knight as we said, and McDonnell keeps piling in on the flank. Now we have pawn captures on f5, and McDonnell should really think about getting this useless knight out. It's doing nothing in the corner, but instead he plays queen to h7, looking forward to picking up the pawn here. We have knight to c4, and indeed McDonnell captures the pawn. Now McDonnell has an extra pawn and he's got a majority on the king side here, but Le Bourdonnais has a rook instead of a knight, so it's still anybody's game. However, Le Bourdonnais has a plan to deal with the pawns. First he captures the bishop with the knight, the queen captures back, the bishop captures the other knight, the pawn captures back, the rook comes across to g1, and now McDonnell captures the d5 pawn. However, this is a mistake. The better move would have been queen to e3 with chick, and after the king moves you can get the knight out. The problem with queen captures d5 is that the queen can chick on h3, and then after you block with the knight, the queen's coming up to the corner, chick again, and then you can either lose your queen by blocking with that or lose your knight by blocking with that. So for example, chick, and then the king moves aside and you're even losing this pawn. However, Le Bourdonnais misses all of this, and instead of giving the chick here, he captures the pawn. And McDonnell still refuses to get his knight out. He plays b6 instead, and Le Bourdonnais goes for queen to g4 with chick. Now, I've had a really great idea. Let's keep track of all the chicks that the players get, and that way we can keep track of equality. That's one chick for Le Bourdonnais. McDonnell plays knight to d7. Here Le Bourdonnais could bring his rook to e1 to slice up the centre of the board and contain McDonnell's position in the corner, but instead he brings the rook all the way across to threaten the queen. The queen could pick up the pawn here, that's okay, but instead McDonnell plays his queen across to e5. We have rook back to g1, threatening the pawn, and McDonnell decides to play queen to e3 with chick. That's one chick all. The king moves aside and we have c6 from McDonnell. Rook to h1 from Le Bourdonnais, and unfortunately for him this will turn out to not be a very active square. We'll play on, king to c7, now a3 from Le Bourdonnais, b5 from McDonnell, and king to a2. Perhaps now is the time to get the knight to a better square, like this, but instead McDonnell plays his queen back to e8. And for Le Bourdonnais, perhaps it's time to get the rook to a better square, like h6, but instead he plays his queen to f5. McDonnell plays the black queen to qe2, the Meghan Markle move, and they both capture the pawns. The rook comes up to h6, better late than never. The black queen goes to e4, the white queen goes to g8. It's good for it to stay on this diagonal so that the black queen can't get on it. The black queen goes back to qe2, and we have rook to h8. Now queen to c4 with chick and forcing a queen exchange would be good for McDonnell, but instead he moves his king to b6. Now this looks a bit strange at first glance because queen to d8 with chick, and then after the king moves you pick up the knight. But this would actually be bad for Le Bourdonnais because it leads to perpetual chick. So after the chick here, the king moves, it's chick again, the king moves, it's another chick, and so on around the pawns. So Le Bourdonnais doesn't want to do this because he actually wants to win. So in this position he doesn't go for the chick on d8, instead he plays his rook down to h7. This threatens the horse again, so McDonnell defends with the king and Le Bourdonnais doubles up. Again, McDonnell does this interesting king to b6 move. Again, it would be perpetual check if he were to capture the knight, and Le Bourdonnais does want to win, so he doesn't go for this. It's this attitude that gets him all the chicks. Rook to g7, queen to e4, and now queen to f2 with chick. That's two chicks for Le Bourdonnais. So McDonnell blocks with the knight, and now we have rook to g1, and queen to c4, that's a chick for McDonnell, it's two chicks all. The king retreats to a1, and now we have a5 from McDonnell. Rook comes across to d1, and now king back to c7. Queen to f6, and knight to b7, rook to g1, and to keep the game even, McDonnell could play a4, but instead he plays c5, which is a terrible blunder. First of all, you play rook to g7 with chick, and after the king moves aside, you play the queen down to f3 and pile up on the knight. So after you move the knight to try to save it, you're bringing the rook to d7, and now there's nothing that can stop McDonnell's position from collapsing. And in fact, Le Bourdonnais did play the first move correctly here, rook to g7 with chick, so that's 3-2 on the chicks, but then after the king moved, he decided to play his queen to f7 to offer a queen exchange, but McDonnell refuses. King to a2, a4, rook to g8, and now the queen into c6. I think he's wary of the rook coming in behind the knight here. We have queen to e6, queen back to f3, and now rook to c8, queen back to h1, still keeping an eye on everything down this diagonal. Queen to f7, king to a7, and now c4, queen to h3, and Le Bourdonnais doubles up with his queen and his rook to pin the knight against the king. And I know you're thinking it's looking bad for McDonnell, but don't worry, he has a plan, and that is to get another chick. And it's 3-3 on the chick score, and the king goes to b1, and McDonnell could actually just perpetual check here, going backwards and forwards between these two squares, but he does want to win, and he decides to capture the pawn here, which reveals the defense of the knight, so that was very clever, well done McDonnell. Queen to d5, trying a new angle, and queen back to b6, queen to c6, offering the queen exchange, which McDonnell accepts this time. And now you can see it's dead even on material. A knight's basically worth 3 pawns, and a rook is worth 5, but McDonnell has 2 extra pawns, so dead even. However, McDonnell does have a passed pawn here, so let's see what happens next. McDonnell starts pushing his pawns and Le Bourdonnais starts getting his king out, but the pawn keeps coming. Now, Le Bourdonnais decides that he better not try and go all the way around here, he better stay in front of the pawns to stop them queening, so he stays in front of them with king to d1. Now, this white rook is blocking off the king into the corner here, and McDonnell's going to have to do something clever to get his king out. So he decides to play king to b8, and this undefends this wing square and tempts the rook with capturing this pawn. And Le Bourdonnais goes for it, rook to a6. The king comes around to c7, and Le Bourdonnais captures the pawn. Now, Le Bourdonnais also has a passed pawn, but McDonnell's do look stronger. McDonnell plays knight to d6, and the rook comes back to a6, blocking off the king from the pawns. It seems as if McDonnell has decided that he needs to keep his kings in front of the passed pawns to stop them queening instead of catching up with his own pawns. The same idea as McDonnell. We have knight to e4, king to c2, and the knight comes back to d6. We now have a4 pushing the passed pawn, and perhaps going to f5 would be a bit more adventurous, but he plays it back to c8 instead, which is a little bit timid. The pawn keeps coming to a5, and now we have king to b7, threatening the rook. Now, McDonnell has got himself into a bit of bother because this wing pawn is getting much stronger. We have rook to f6, knight to a6, and a good move for Le Bourdonnais here would be a chick with the rook, and after the king moves down, you bring the rook across to here, and you're going to pick up 2 pawns for 1. So, for example, the knight comes down, you collect the pawn, the black king collects a white pawn, and you pick up a second black pawn, and Le Bourdonnais is completely winning. However, he didn't do this chick move with the rook. Instead, he pushed b3, and now c3 from McDonnell, and he's got 2 connected passed pawns, but no obvious way to push through yet until Le Bourdonnais plays b4, and now suddenly he has 3 connected passed pawns, but not for long, because rook to b6 with chick, and it's 4-3 to Le Bourdonnais. We now have king to c7, and the rook captures the b pawn. The knight comes to c6, and this attacks everything as well as defending the d pawn. So the rook comes up to b5, and the knight goes across to a7 to attack the rook again, so it backs off to b1. We have king to c6 from McDonnell, and now a6 pushing the pawn a step further. The knight goes to c8, and Le Bourdonnais moves his king to attack the undefended pawn. Now, unfortunately for McDonnell, he can't very well move to defend it because it takes his eye off of the b7 square and lets the rook come in. If the rook comes in, it's a massive problem. If you hang around trying to defend your own pawns, then Le Bourdonnais is just going to push his pawn, and you're going to have to give up your knight to stop it queening. If instead you try to attack the rook, thinking that you can't push the pawn because you'll capture the rook and keep everything under control, well, if you try that, then the king is just coming to c2 in a waiting move and leaving you in Zugzwang. Every move that black plays here is bad. You're either going to lose both pawns or the knight. So what does McDonnell do? Well, in this position, he decides that he's going to defend the b7 square. He moves his king back to c7 and gives up the pawns. So Le Bourdonnais captures the first pawn. McDonnell pushes his pawn to c2 to threaten the rook, but of course the rook just goes to c1 and it's going to capture it shortly. McDonnell moves his queen to b6, and of course the rook captures the pawn. So Le Bourdonnais is technically completely winning, as McDonnell only has 1 horse left. However, the reality is that this is a horrendously tricky endgame. McDonnell can't capture the pawn here because he'll lose the knight, so knight to a7, and we have rook to a2 to defend the pawn. Now, it's worth mentioning at this point that we're up to move 85. The longest game we've had was match 2, game 1, which had 99 moves. Let's put a counter down here and see if we can get to 100. We have knight to c6 with chick, so it's 4 chicks each, complete equity. We have king to c4 and knight back to a7. Rook to a1, knight to c6, rook to a3, knight back to a7 again, and here Le Bourdonnais throws away the win with king to d5. But let's not be too hard on him, because to win from that position would have taken something like another 30 or 40 ridiculous moves. For now, let's move on, but we'll come back to that position and go through it at the end of the video. We have knight to b5. So let's look at Le Bourdonnais' options. The rook is under attack, so you can try to save it, for example rook to a1, but then you're getting forked and then you're picking up the pawn. Now this is a knight versus rook endgame where the defending king is next to the knight. Now this is a basic drawn endgame. I know this because Jesus said so in his endgame Bible, so it must be true. So how about instead of this rook to a1 move, you just push the pawn? Well, McDonnell can't capture the rook because then you're getting a queen, but if he captures the pawn, again you're into the drawn rook versus knight endgame. So what did Le Bourdonnais actually do? In this position, he moved his rook to b3 to pin the knight, but of course the king can now pick up the pawn, and it's again into the drawn knight versus rook endgame, but they carried on for another couple of moves. King to c5, knight up to a7, rook up to b8, and king down to a5. and they agreed that they had achieved equality with 4 chicks each, so they got rid of all the DEI managers and called it a day. So 92 moves, not quite making it to the 100 this time. It's still 3 games to 2 to Le Bourdonnais. Let's go back to where Le Bourdonnais could have won the game near the end, and I'll just play the continuation out for you through the outro music. Thanks to all the women who kept out of the way while the men were busy, and I'll see you again next time.